All right, so here we go. I finally finished the writing I was doing on Ronald Hughes. So, this is the story of Ronald Hughes, who was one of the lawyers for the Manson family during the Tate LaBianca trial. Ronald William Hughes was born on March 16th, 1935, in Los Angeles County, California. His parents were John Granville Hughes and Anita Olga Davis. Relatively little is known about his life, his early life at least, though there was a 1940 census record I found, and it shows that he had two siblings. In 1940, when he was 5 years old, Ronald's older brother, John, was 10, and his what seems to be older sister, Stephanie, might have been 10 or 12. The census record seems to have messed up here. And I believe in one of the books about Charles Manson, probably Helter Skelter, there are a couple of sources that say that Ronald Hughes' sister was older than him, but it seems that Ronald was the baby of the family. I couldn't find the 1950 census record for his family, though, during the time of my research. There is a small article from the Daily News Post that's dated around April 11th, 1957, talking about a car crash with a Ronald Hughes and a John Weingart. It seemed to only be a minor accident that Weingart was barely injured from. I'm not sure 100% if this is our Ronald Hughes, but it seems to match up with his age, as both Ronalds were 22 years old in 1957. There are multiple people named Ronald Hughes that show up in the news archives, though it doesn't seem like our Ronald showed up much at all. I'm unsure if he ever married. I assume not. At some point in time, Ronald served in the Army as an SP2, serving in Korea. On page 335 of the Manson File by Nicholas Schreck, he mentions Hughes. He says, Ronald Hughes asked the judge to formally censor Nixon for his breach of justice. Older refused to do any such thing. Manson's lawyer put forth a motion for a mistrial. This was also denied. In fact, Van Houten, despite her seeming loyalty to Manson and the other defendants in court, wavered back and forth even well into the trial. She was on the verge of cooperating with the prosecution immediately after the death of her attorney Ronald Hughes, which made her think better of it. In Susan Atkins's book, Child of Satan, Child of God, she says, one very serious thing that was blamed on us and our colleagues, but which I am convinced to this day was not done by us, was the death of Ronald Hughes, one of our lawyers. Hughes was a big, bearded, long-haired, good-natured man with a reputation as a hippie lawyer. Although he had never tried a case, he was taken on by Leslie as a replacement for a dismissed lawyer. On Monday, November 30th, Hughes was absent and court convened. Much investigation revealed that the burly lawyer had gone to an area called Sespe. Hot Springs. Much investigation revealed that the burly lawyer had gone to an area called Sespe Hot Springs, some distance northwest of Los Angeles, where he had often spent weekends camping. Flash floods had occurred that weekend. It was assumed by everyone, especially Bugliosi, that the Manson family had done Hughes in. Actually, I believe the lawyer died an accidental death. His body was found by fishermen after the completion of the trial, wedged between two big rocks in the Sespe Creek. It seems that there was no mention of Ronald Hughes at all in any of Tex Watson's books. Of course, Hughes was mentioned the most in Helter Skelter by Vincent Bugliosi. Ronald was very new to the legal game, and it seems that he might have been hired on initially as a way to bolster Manson with Hughes's own hippie background. Hughes is first mentioned on page 260 of the book Helter Skelter, being among the plethora of lawyers that first visited Manson at the LA County Jail. Ronald Hughes was called in to be a substitute for Manson's court-appointed attorney, Charles Hollipeter. Charles Hollowpeter had initially asked that Manson be examined by a psychiatrist, which enraged him. To quote, Hughes had been one of the first attorneys to call on Manson. He had remained on the periphery of the case ever since, his chief function being to run errands for Manson, as indicated by a document Manson had signed on February 17th, designating him one of his legal runners. Judge Keene granted the substitution. Hollowpeter, one of L.A. County's most successful defense attorneys, was out after 13 days. Hughes, who had never tried a case before, was in. Bugliosi recalled Ronald as something of an intellectual. Hughes was a huge, balding man with a long, scraggly beard. His various items of apparel rarely matched, and usually evidence of numerous food stains. As one reporter remarked, you could usually tell what Ron had had for breakfast for the past several weeks. Hughes, whom I would get to know well in the months ahead, and for whom I developed a growing respect, once admitted to me that he had bought his suits for $1 apiece at MGM. They were from Walter Slezak's old wardrobe. The press was quick to dub him Manson's hippie lawyer. Hughes's first two acts were to withdraw the motions for the psychiatric examination and the severance, which was granted. His third and fourth requests were that Manson be allowed to revert pro per status and to deliver a speech to the court. Denied. Charles Manson really wanted to represent himself in court, and that was one of the long-standing battles that was had in the courtroom, where him and the other defendants would claim that they wanted to represent themselves, which in Helter Skelter is referred to as pro per. When I was in school, this is also referred to as pro se. In Jeff Gein's book, Manson, he wrote that Hughes had worked himself into Charlie's good graces by handling the legal paperwork necessary to transfer the rights for Charlie's songs to Phil Kaufman as part of getting the album release. I made a video years ago that sort of touched on Manson's music, and after he was arrested for the Tate LaBianca murders, Manson had wanted Phil Kaufman to help put out his music. So that's what Jeff Gein's book is referring to with this excerpt. Charlie clearly intended for Hughes to be a figurehead. There was no way Charlie would allow anyone else to orchestrate his defense. Given his lack of trial experience, Hughes was someone the prosecutors didn't mind having in a courtroom. I'm sure that the prosecution probably thought that they would easily win because Hughes was inexperienced. There were still changes ahead, though. Among the casualties would be both Ira Rayner and Ronald Hughes, each of whom dared go against Manson's wishes. Rayner would lose considerable time and money for having linked himself with the Manson defense. His loss would be small compared to Hughes, who just 8 months later would pay with his life. In Helter Skelter, it states that 2 weeks before the start of the Tate LaBianca trial, Manson requested and obtained the substitution of Irving Kanarek for Ronald Hughes. This is dated as June 1st through the 14th of 1970. Bugliosi objected to this because Kanarek was notorious for filibustering and objecting continuously in the courtroom from previous cases. To quote, Kanarek frequently scored points. He noted, for example, that our office hadn't tried to challenge Ronald Hughes, who had never tried a case in his life, on the grounds that his representation might hurt Manson. Kanarek, very much to the point, asked that the prosecution's motion be struck on the basis there is no basis for it in law. Whatever that means. I believe that this was touching on the fact that Bugliosi and the prosecution tried to make it appear that they wanted the trial to go as fair as possible. If I understand correctly, it seems that Kanarek was pointing out how unfair it would be to have a fresh and green lawyer to represent Manson. Being so new, Ronald Hughes couldn't represent Manson as accurately as he needed to be because of his lack of experience. Bugliosi's book doesn't say this outright. Moments like this, where the defense would point out the hypocrisy and shady deals of the prosecution, seem to be glossed over in Bugliosi's book. This is my personal opinion, but I believe that Bugliosi would obscure the reader's view with legalese. The common man doesn't know the ins and outs of the law, and if you fill the book with jargon, no one will know what you've done wrong. Late in August 1970, multiple newspapers printed that President Richard Nixon had declared Charles Manson guilty. This period in time is listed as August 3rd through the 19th in Helter Skelter. Various articles show the common headline, "Manson guilty, Nixon declares." This was a huge deal because with the President of the United States making such a statement, this skewed the case. With the U.S. court system, everyone has a right to a fair trial. If a case gains too much publicity, it can cause bias in the jury. If the jury were to have seen any of the newspapers where the president was calling Manson guilty, that could cause such a bias and result in a mistrial. Obviously, a mistrial was not what Bugliosi wanted to have. And, interestingly, the courts didn't call for a mistrial. At least one was not granted. On page 432 of Helter Skelter, it states that Manson suddenly stood and, turning towards the jury box, held up a copy of the front page of the Los Angeles Times. A bailiff grabbed it, but not before Manson had shown the jury the huge black headline, "Manson guilty, Nixon declares." Judge Older had taken the jury out, then demanded to know which attorney, against his express orders, had brought a newspaper into court. There were several denials, but no one confessed. There have been various speculations over who brought this newspaper into court. I believe I've read in the past some believed it was Bugliosi. I believe some might have thought it was Daishin. I'm not, but nobody knows for sure. There was no question now that the jury would have to be voir dired, as Bugliosi had stated in Helter Skelter. Each member was brought in separately and questioned by the judge under oath. Of the 12 jurors and 6 alternates, 11 were aware of the full headline. 2 saw only the words "Manson guilty." 4 only saw the paper or the name Manson. And 1, Mr. Zamora, didn't see anything. "I was looking at the clock at the time," he's quoted as having said. Bugliosi wrote that each juror was questioned as to their reaction, one woman saying, "Well, my first thought was, that's ridiculous." Another said, "I think if the president declared that, it was pretty stupid of him." All 18 jurors stated under oath that they had not been influenced by the headline and that they would consider only the evidence presented to them in court. Bugliosi wrote that he believed the jurors. Bugliosi wrote that some national columnists stated that if Manson was convicted, conviction would be reversed on appeal because of Nixon's statement. He refuted this, writing, on the contrary, since it was Manson himself who brought the newspaper to the attention of the jury, this was invited error, which simply means that a defendant cannot benefit from his own wrongdoing. It's strange to me, though, that he wrote that. While Manson was seen in the courtroom with the paper, it was never proven who brought the paper in. And small details like that, for me, are where you can read just a little bit more between the lines of Bugliosi's book. That tells me that the whole story was never told. Furthermore, it goes to show how much Bugliosi wanted to make himself look like the good guy, the savior, so to speak. In reality, he was sensationalizing the court case, instead of actually trying to find the truth. To me, it seems that Bugliosi seems to have hid and ignored things for his own personal gain. There is so much nuance to this story, so much more than previously thought. On page 436, there is a part where Ronald Hughes talked to Bugliosi. He said, "I want to apologize, Vince." Bugliosi replies, with, "No apology necessary, Ron. It was a heat-of-the-moment remark. I'm only sorry that Older found you in contempt." Hughes says, "No, I don't mean that. What I did was a hell of a lot worse. I was the one who suggested that Irving Kanarek become Manson's attorney." In the next page, Bugliosi wrote that the most effective cross-examination of Linda Kasabian was, surprisingly, that of Ronald Hughes. Though this was his first trial, and he frequently made procedural mistakes, Hughes was familiar with the hippie subculture, having been a part of it. He knew about the drugs, mysticism, karma, auras, vibrations, and when he questioned Linda about these things, he made her look just a little odd, just a wee bit zingy. He had her admitting that she believed in ESP, that there were times at Spawn when she actually felt like she was a witch. Hughes requested that the court appoint psychiatrists to examine Linda Kasabian. Judge Older replied, "I find no basis for psychiatric examination in this case." Hughes was later made to be the lawyer of Leslie Van Houten. On page 444 of Helter Skelter, it states, "Since Leslie was not charged with the 5 Tate murders, Hughes did not question any of these witnesses. He did, however, make an interesting motion. He asked that he and his clients be permitted to be absent themselves from the courtroom while those murders were discussed. Though the motion was denied, his attempt to separate his clients from these events ran directly counter to Manson's own collective defense. And I wondered how Charlie was reacting to it." Bugliosi wrote that he was impressed with Hughes, saying that for his first trial, he was doing damn well. A few excerpts from the book show that Hughes would ask interesting questions during cross-examinations. He asked Linda Kasabian and Brooks Poston if they felt like Charles Manson had them under a spell, among other similar questions. Jeff Geen wrote that Hughes's lack of courtroom experience had been evident throughout the trial, and to make things worse, he was clumsy and constantly tripped over Leslie Van Houten's feet when standing to make objections. In the chapter of Helter Skelter that dates November 19th to December 20th, 1970, the defense claimed that they rested. The 3 female defendants, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Leslie Van Houten, had wanted to testify. The defense opposed this and wanted to rest their case. The women wanted to take the stand and state that Manson was not involved, and they were the ones that planned and committed the murders. Standing up against Manson, for the first time, Ronald Hughes observed, "I refuse to take part in any proceeding where I am forced to push a client out the window." Judge Older recessed the court for 10 days to give the attorneys time to prepare their jury instructions and arguments. Bugliosi wrote that, being his first trial, Ronald Hughes had never argued before a jury before, or participated in drawing up the instructions with the judge, which would give the jury just before they began their deliberations. He was obviously looking forward to it, however. He confided to TV newscaster Stan Atkinson he was convinced he could win an acquittal for Leslie Van Houten. He wouldn't even get the chance to try. When court resumed on Monday, November 30th, Ronald Hughes was absent. Judge Older asked the other defense attorneys if they knew where Hughes was. Fitzgerald said that he had last talked to Ron on Thursday or Friday, and that he sounded okay at that time. Hughes often spent his weekends camping at Sespe Hot Springs, a rugged terrain some 130 miles northwest of Los Angeles. There had been floods in the area the past weekend. It was possible that Hughes had been stranded there. The next day, we learned that Hughes had gone to Sespe on Friday with 2 teenagers, James Forsher and Lauren Elder, in Miss Elder's Volkswagen. The pair, who were questioned but not held, said that when it began raining, they had decided to return to L.A., but Hughes had decided to stay over until Sunday. When the two decided to leave, however, their auto became mired down, and they were forced to abandon it and hike out. 3 other youths had seen Hughes on the morning of the following day, Saturday the 28th. He was alone at the time and on high ground, and well away from the flood area. Chatting with them briefly, he appeared neither ill nor in any danger. Polygraphed, the 3 were found to have no additional knowledge, and they were not held. Since Forsher and Elder had last seen Hughes a day earlier, they apparently were not polygraphed, and their story was taken at face value. Owing to the continued bad weather, it was 2 days before the Ventura Sheriff's Office could get a helicopter up to search the area. In the meantime, rumors abounded. One was to the effect that Hughes had deliberately skipped, either to avoid argument or to sabotage the trial. Knowing Ron, I seriously doubted if this was true. I became convinced it wasn't when reporters visited the place where Hughes lived. He slept on a mattress in a garage behind the home of a friend. According to reporters, the place was a mess. One remarked that he wouldn't even let his dog sleep there. But on the wall of the garage, neatly framed and carefully hung, was Ronald Hughes's bar certificate. There were multiple reports of people fitting Ronald Hughes's description, seen in various places such as boarding a bus in Reno, driving on the San Bernardino Freeway, drinking at a bar in Baja, though none checked out. On December 2nd, 1970, Judge Older told Leslie Van Houten he felt a co-counsel should be brought to represent her during Hughes's absence. Leslie said she would refuse any other attorney. On December 3rd, Judge Older appointed Maxwell Keith as co-counsel for Leslie. Despite there being an air and ground search for Ronald Hughes, they couldn't find any trace of him. The abandoned Volkswagen was found, with a batch of court transcripts inside, but other papers Hughes was known to have had, including a secret psychiatric report on Leslie Van Houten, were missing. On December 6th, Paul Fitzgerald told reporters, "I think Ron is dead." On December 7th, an all-points bulletin was issued for Hughes, with Lasso admitting, "This is something you do when you have no other leads." On December 8th, Judge Older went to the Ambassador Hotel to inform the jury of the reason for the delay. He also told them, "It appears fairly certain that you will be sequestered over the Christmas holidays." They took it much better than expected. The jury had been sequestered for 10 months already for the trial. On December 12th, the search for Ronald Hughes was suspended. There was the persistent rumor that Ronald Hughes was murdered by the family. Though there has never been any proof of this, even Bugliosi wrote that there was more than ample cause for speculation. In Helter Skelter, Hughes is described as having gone from an errand boy for Manson to becoming increasingly independent. Hughes was strongly opposing his clients taking the stand to absolve Charlie. Bugliosi wrote that he heard from several sources, including Paul Fitzgerald, that Ronald Hughes was afraid of Manson. It's possible that he showed this fear, which, in Manson's case, was like waving a red flag before a bull. Fear turned Charlie on. Helter Skelter speculates that it could have been a tactic to delay the trial, with the hope of either having a mistrial or to set the stage for a reverse on appeal. Interestingly, around the time that Hughes went missing, Bruce Davis and Nancy Pittman voluntarily surrendered to the police on December 2nd, 1970. Nancy had been missing for several weeks after failing to appear for sentencing on a forgery charge, while Bruce Davis had evaded the law for over several months. Bugliosi speculated that these events were related to Hughes's disappearance. In the chapter dating December 21st, 1970 through January 25th, 1971, it starts off with the 4 defendants causing a disturbance. Manson threw a paperclip at the judge, the girls accusing him of doing away with Hughes. All obviously planned actions to garner the day's headlines, Helter Skelter quoted. In the chapter dated March 18th to the 29th of 1971, Bugliosi wrote, "In the avalanche of stories on the Manson verdict, one small item which appeared that same day went almost unnoticed. The Ventura County Sheriff's Office reported that they had found a body believed to be that of the missing defense attorney, Ronald Hughes. The badly decomposed corpse had been found face down, wedged between 2 shoulders in Sespe Creek, miles from where Hughes had last been seen alive. The fishermen had discovered the body early Saturday, but didn't report it until Sunday night because they didn't want to spoil their fishing trip. The cause of death at this time was unknown. Through our office, I ordered an immediate autopsy," Bugliosi said. Helter Skelter doesn't mention Hughes again until page 624. The book was talking about a James Forsher and Lauren Elder that drove Ronald Hughes to Sespe Hot Springs. Bugliosi thought that the two were potentially connected to James and Lauren Willett, a couple that was murdered around this time period. In the book, it seems to have just been a mere coincidence. Helter Skelter also talks about the rumor that Ronald Hughes was murdered by the Manson family. While the trial was still going on, a movie titled Manson was made by Lawrence Merrick. A documentary on the Manson family. It didn't talk about the crimes as much as it focused on the culture of the family on Spawn and Barker Ranch. Helter Skelter states that Lawrence Merrick gained the confidence of the Manson girls. Sandra Good admitted, for example, on film, that when she and Mary Bruner learned of the Tate murders while still in Los Angeles County Jail, Mary said, "Right on." And I said, "Wow, looks like we did it." Off camera and unrecorded, Sandy made a number of other admissions to Merrick, in the presence of one other witness, that to date the family had killed 35 to 40 people, and that Hughes was the first of the retaliation murders. Bugliosi wrote that he received the autopsy report on Ronald Hughes some weeks after the conclusion of the trial. The identification of Hughes was made through dental x-rays. Yet the rest of the autopsy report added little to the newspaper accounts. It noted, the decedent was observed face down in a pool of water, with the head and shoulder wedged under a large rock. One arm was almost completely severed at the shoulder, and there were large open areas in the chest and back. Other than this, no outward evidence of violence was noted. While no evidence of foul play was indicated by the x-rays, all this was qualified more than a little by the fact that the body was badly decomposed. As for the report's primary findings, there were none. Nature of death? Undetermined. Cause of death? Undetermined. Bugliosi wrote that he was dissatisfied with the report and requested that his office conduct an investigation into the death of Ronald Hughes, but the request was denied. It being decided that, since there was no evidence of foul play, such an investigation was unnecessary. He wrote that in 1976, an anonymous former member of the Manson family had called and stated that Hughes had been murdered by the Manson family. Lieutenant Greg Husband of the Ventura County Sheriff's Office reported that, since it was never determined whether Hughes's death was the result of an accident, homicide, or suicide, the Hughes case is still open, though no investigators are presently assigned to the case. It should be remembered that there is no statute of limitations for the crime of murder. I did a lot of my own research when trying to find out anything about Ronald Hughes. So some of the information that I'll talk about will be repeated, but this is for the sake of comparison of actual news articles that I clipped myself and what we were presented by Vincent Bugliosi, as Helter Skelter is essentially the Bible for people to read about Manson. You're supposed to read Helter Skelter if you're going to go into anything about Manson and the Manson family at all. So these are my findings, my clippings, and I'm curious what you guys might think in comparison. Going in chronological order, we'll start with August of 1970. So, an article from the Memphis Press Scimitar, dated August 11th, 1970, talked about how the defense was squabbling amongst themselves. Paul Fitzgerald and Ronald Hughes strongly objected to questioning of Linda Kasabian by Irving Kanarek. Manson interjected himself into the controversy by calling out suddenly in the courtroom, "You're getting me locked up into this guy." Manson was objecting to Kanarek's asking questions over and over again and showing pictures which could tie him into the case. Fitzgerald charged that Kanarek was acting more like a third prosecutor in his questioning of Linda Kasabian, that Kanarek was doing a good job for Manson, but he was implicating the other defendants. This article says that Ronald Hughes was the attorney for Susan Atkins, surely in error. He's quoted as saying that he thought the riff, if it continued, is going to do us irreparable. I don't see us far apart, but I feel we've got to get Kanarek back in line. The judge rejected a motion by Kanarek for a mistrial on grounds that Linda Kasabian was lying and that her testimony was tainted because she felt she had to curry favor with the prosecution. Next, we'll jump to October of 1970. On October 6, 1970, the Morning News posted an article titled, "Manson Lunges at Trial Judge." Manson shouted, "I'm gonna fight for my life," and dove across the counsel table towards the judge. He yelled, "In the name of Christian justice, someone should cut your head off," as bailiffs subdued him in a wrestling match in front of the bench. One said Manson had sharpened a pencil in his hand. The defendants were ejected the week before, twice, for singing and shouting insults at the judge, and the defendants were admitted at morning session. Manson interrupted proceedings to address Superior Court Judge Older, complaining about the trial. The judge repeatedly told him to be silent. Manson asked, "Are you going to use this courtroom to kill me? Do you want me to be dead?" His voice rising. "The minute you use this courtroom to kill me, you know what I'm going to do to you?" Judge Older asked, "What are you going to do to me?" "You order me to be quiet while you kill me. I'm going to fight for my life one way or another. You should have let me do it with my own words. I'm going to have you removed. I have my own system, you know." The article then says, with that, the slender 5'5" defendant launched himself headfirst over the counsel table in a dive that carried him within 2 feet of the bench. So, there you have it. Manson was 5'5". Height debate over. Anyway, the article stated that the attorneys recoiled, and a bailiff was initially standing behind Manson, and then jumped on top of him, with 3 others wrestling him into submission. The bailiffs were half carrying Manson out when he delivered the "cut your head off" remark. The 3 female defendants began a sing-song chant that was largely unintelligible, even to the court reporter. In it, the word "kill" was constantly repeated. The judge ordered them to be ejected. Susan Atkins tried for a moment to wrench away from the female bailiff that was escorting her. The defendants were taken to an adjoining detention room and listened on loudspeaker while testimony was ordered to resume. Ronald Hughes moved for a mistrial on grounds the judge and jury were prejudiced by what they saw. The judge denied it. On October 19, 1970, the Oakland Tribune posted a small article titled, "Manson Trial Lawyer Jailed." It was about how Ronald Hughes was arrested on a traffic warrant that alleged defective brakes. It also stated that he could not make bail, which was $63.50. The article had said that he had been sentenced to a night in jail or a $50 fine for contempt of court in the Tate case a few weeks prior. He was out of funds then, so he took the night in jail. On October 20th, 1970, The Independent posted an article titled, "Manson Attorneys Clash as Murder Trial Drags On." It talked about multiple things like Irving Kanarek refusing to halt the questioning of Greg Jacobson, despite obviously heated objection from the other 3 defense attorneys. The 3 attorneys issued proceedings to substitute Kanarek from the case and take over the defense of Manson themselves in order to expedite the trial. By the end of this article, the trial had reached its 19th week. The article also states that following Monday, Ronald Hughes inadvertently delayed the trial when he was jailed in West Los Angeles over a traffic warrant. Hughes was arrested on the warrants and jailed overnight. He was arraigned in Santa Monica Municipal Court at the time the murder trial was scheduled to begin. He was released on a suspended sentence, though he didn't make it back to the courtroom until the afternoon. The final part of the article stated the defendants hadn't appeared in court for over a week since Manson had tried to attack the judge with a pencil. There is a strange photo on the internet of a Halloween party with the legal team dated 1970. It shows some people wearing small noose-like necklaces around their necks, and there's a sign close to Bugliosi's head that seems to quote what Tex Watson said at Cielo Drive, which was, "I'm the devil, and I'm here to do the devil's work." Moving forward to November of 1970. On November 11th, 1970, the New Jersey Journal posted an article titled, "Defense. LSD made girl hear Manson." This article was unique in that it summarized a part of the trial where Ronald Hughes had questioned Diane Lake on the stand. The article talked about how the defense sought to establish that Diane took LSD so many times she fabricated conversations she heard implicating Charles Manson and a female co-defendant. The article wrote, Diane Lake, who joined the Manson family when she was 15 and lived with the group for 2 years, said she was still in love with Manson and jealous of the attention he gave other female members of the hippie cult. This is something that was touched on in Diane's book. She was a minor when she lived with the Manson family and went on trial. It should be remembered that she was basically abandoned by her biological family, and Manson was all she had. In my personal opinion, I think that this article was slanted to make it seem like Diane was a pro-Mansonite on the same level as someone like Patricia Krenwinkel. But, of course, this was not the case. The article states that Diane's testimony about Leslie Van Houten included the admission that she had, on occasion, heard Manson's voice, although he was not present. Ronald Hughes questioned her about the voice and what it would say. It would say, "This is Charles Manson speaking," Diane replied. "You mean like a Mattel doll? This is Charles Manson speaking?" Hughes asked. Diane then broke into laughter and said he was not like that. Hughes then imitated a high-pitched woman's voice and asked if Diane ever heard, "This is Leslie speaking?" Diane broke into giggles again. Hughes asked, "Are you sure you were there? Are you sure Leslie was there?" "Yes, I'm sure," Diane replied. Diane Lake mentions Ronald Hughes in her book, though minorly. Of course, her book doesn't focus on the trials that much as a whole, though I do wish she had divulged more information. On page 356 of her book, she gives an explanation of why the defense was the way it was. Because of two court cases called People versus Aranda and Bruton versus the United States, and by joining all the accused as co-defendants in a single trial, something that a non-family attorney might have insisted was not in the best interests of his client, Charlie made sure the girls could not implicate one another or implicate him. She talked about her time in court, and to quote, "It was the defense attorney's turn. They cross-examined me for 5 days and were far more strident than when we were only in front of the judge. The attorneys tried to show that my testimony was coerced by the police department, who, when they first interrogated me, threatened me with the gas chamber. When Ronald Hughes didn't have any questions for me, Charlie shouted out to him, 'Why don't you go home then if you're not going to ask any questions, lawyer?' Charlie didn't understand. By the limitation of the Aranda Bruton motion, there was nothing Ronald Hughes could ask me that wouldn't violate that rule. To cover himself, Ronald Hughes claimed censorship by Judge Older. Charlie then threatened the judge, saying, 'One of these days, you're going to be overruled, man.' Then he added, 'You've got your flunkies. It'd be a different story if it were just you and I.' Irving Canarek's turn to cross-examine me. He caught me completely off guard. He then asked me if I had been jealous when Charlie was paying attention to other girls, especially towards the end of our time together. Again, I had to say yes. I didn't mind Charlie being with other women, but he had rejected me even before his latest recruits had come on board. 'Are you in love with Mr. Manson right now?' 'I guess so.' Canarek had started to ask another question when Charlie shouted out to me, 'You loved everybody. Don't pull it all on Mr. Manson.' The entire courtroom, including the judge, burst out in laughter. Charlie showed me how little I really meant to him, and how he was only out for himself. This was near the end of Diane Lake's book, and she didn't mention Ronald Hughes any further. An article from the Oroville Mercury Register, dated November 11th, 1970, went a little further into the Diane Lake part of the trial. Irving Canarek, Manson's lawyer, questioned Diane at length. 'Have you ever been intimate with Mr. Manson?' 'Yes,' she replied, in a soft voice. Canarek brought up how, during August of 1969, Manson began sleeping with another girl named Stephanie Schramm. 'Do you know the feeling of jealousy?' Canarek asked. 'I think so.' 'Did you love Mr. Manson in August of 1969? I guess so.' This is when Manson yelled that she loved everyone, and the trial was recessed. On November 13th, 1970, the Courier-Post posted an article titled, "Key Witness Relates Beating by Manson." It was another article about Diane Lake on the stand. The article states that Diane told the jury that Manson had beaten her with a chair, whipped her with an electric cord, kicked her, and threatened her life. She said for a time that she feared to tell the truth about the family and had previously lied to a grand jury because of fear of her life. Bugliosi asked what Manson had said in threatening her. Lake is quoted, "He said, 'I'm going to kill you, Snake. I'm going to kill you.'" Bugliosi asked if he ever hurt her. Lake said, "Yes. He hit me with a chair and kicked me. He whipped me with a cord." "What kind of cord?" Bugliosi asked. "Electric cord," Diane replied. Ronald Hughes was the last to cross-examine Diane. He asked her, "Diane, Do you feel Charles Manson will go to the gas chamber because of your lying on the witness stand? Williosi interrupted. Oh, wait a while. Don't get like Canarek, Mr. Hughes. Judge Older warned all the lawyers about their conduct. In an article dated November 18th, 1970, it was divulged that Ronald Hughes had used and experimented with hallucinogenic drugs in the past. He admitted himself to being a pauper. On November 19th, 1970, the Ukiah Daily Journal posted the article, "Defense Rests in Tate Murder Trial." The defense announced that they had rested their case for Manson and Co. Paul Fitzgerald rose as the defense was expected to begin in the case of the trial, and announced, "The defense rests." The other three defense lawyers also stood and announced that they wished to rest their case on behalf of their clients. Patricia Krenwinkel rose to her feet and announced that she wished to testify in the presence of the jury. Charles Manson said nothing, but sat stolidly in his chair. Fitzgerald added that the provision that the defense wished to rest subject to being able to introduce certain exhibits. It was not made clear what he was referring to. Judge Older summoned the defense and prosecution attorneys to his bench for a conference, and then the trial was recessed briefly. There was pandemonium in the courtroom when Fitzgerald let loose the bombshell that the defense would call no witnesses at all. Fitzgerald had said previously that he had subpoenaed between 15 and 30 witnesses, and that Manson would probably be one of the last to testify. The totally unexpected defense tactic came after Older had rejected defense motions for a directed verdicts of acquittal for Manson, Krenwinkel, Susan Atkins, and Leslie Van Houten, on the grounds that the state had not presented sufficient evidence to convict them. Fitzgerald's announcement that he wished to rest the case came with the jury seated in the body, and they were obviously startled. When the recess was called, the defendants were all led from the courtroom to an anteroom on the floor above, while the attorneys went into Older's chambers to discuss the next procedure in the trial. The defense had argued that key prosecution witness, Linda Kasabian, was an accomplice in the crimes, and therefore that, under California law, substantial additional evidence was needed to corroborate her story and bring a conviction. Older ruled that Kasabian was an accomplice, but his finding indicated that he felt there had been sufficient additional evidence. Fitzgerald had said that Kasabian had been arrested for the same 7 murders and a charge of conspiracy, that she had been arraigned, that a motion for dismissal of charges against her had been denied, and the trial date had been set. Not until well into her testimony from the witness stand did the prosecution announce that it was granting her immunity, Fitzgerald said. He went over a long account of the various criminal acts committed by Kasabian in accompanying Tex Watson and Co., and that it was pointed out that Kasabian had full opportunity to sound an alarm but instead helped in the getaway. Canarek stated there was no evidence to back up charges that Manson was the leader of a conspiracy to commit the slaying. There's no evidence of putting heads together. Whenever the district attorney's office doesn't have a real case, they throw in a conspiracy charge. Canarek pointed out that the prosecution did not contend that Manson was at the Tate home the night of the murders, and their testimony was that he spent only 4 minutes in the La Bianca residence. Ronald Hughes contended that Leslie's charges should be acquitted on grounds that evidence against her was insufficient. Hughes said that Kasabian had testified only that she saw Van Houten standing outside a house next to the La Bianca residence. Dacian also asked for exoneration for Susan Atkins under the same grounds that Kasabian's testimony alone was not sufficient. On November 20th, 1970, the Charlotte News posted an article titled, "Judge Determined to Allow Girls to Testify at Trial." It said that Judge Older had been determined to let Manson's girls testify, but he was stymied by the refusal of the defense lawyers to ask them any questions, including ones that the girls themselves had written. Chief Defense Attorney Fitzgerald is quoted as having said, "We will defy the court on this, even if we have to go to jail. The judge has 3 other options: asking the questions himself, allowing the girls to question themselves, or dismissing us and appointing 3 new defense attorneys. But with none of these options are the girls being represented by the lawyers of their choice. He's in a box." Each of the lawyers insisted that the girls would only incriminate themselves. Fitzgerald, Shin, Hughes, and Kanarek entered a surprise motion to rest the case without presenting a single witness. The article even stated that the prosecution feared that the girls would confess their involvement in the 7 murders, but insist that Manson had nothing to do with it. Judge Older and the lawyers argued back and forth over what was happening in the chambers and out, and then the judge recessed overnight to figure out what to do. Fitzgerald is quoted saying, "He insists that the girls have a constitutional right to testify, regardless of what their attorneys want. But I don't intend to have to come before any bar association committee and say that I helped my client incriminate herself." Susan Atkins got as far as taking the witness stand and identifying herself when her lawyer, Day Shin, balked at asking questions. As soon as Fitzgerald rested, Krenwinkel jumped to her feet and protested, "I wish to testify." Charles Manson sat calmly, smiling. The lawyer, presumably Fitzgerald, said, "I don't know what questions to ask." I presume Judge Older was the one that was quoted in the article saying, "Don't you have some questions there, written out by your client?" "I refuse to ask those questions." "You have a duty." "I have a duty to my client, not to help her incriminate herself." The judge called all the lawyers into his chambers for a final go-round and then recessed. Ronald Hughes is quoted, "The judge feels that we would be held up to the ridicule and shame of the community if we refuse to ask those questions. I feel like we will be held up to the contempt of the world if we do." The prosecution rested its case that Monday after 17 weeks and 17,659 pages of testimony and 84 witnesses. The judge permitted a recess to let the defense decide what it would do. Vince Bugliosi admitted that he was dumbfounded by the developments. He's quoted, "I'm disappointed. After all those weeks, it's kind of a shabby denouncement. I thought they'd put on some kind of defense." Now on to December of 1970. On December 2nd, 1970, the Hanford Sentinel posted an article about Hughes, who went missing. Rain forced the cancellation of what would have been a helicopter search. He was supposedly stranded in the Los Padres National Forest because of flooding and mudslides caused by a rainstorm that weekend. Judge Older issued a body attachment order that Tuesday, which directed the sheriff's deputies to use all possible means to find the lawyer and bring him to court. And I never read this anywhere, but I can only assume, I wonder how, with his disappearance for, I guess, probably the 3rd time, how many of the lawyers thought that maybe he was originally just got caught in jail again. The Daily Herald also posted on December 2nd, 1970, a more extended version of the previous article, saying that no formal court proceedings could take place without Hughes, and his continued absence had raised the possibility of a mistrial being declared for Leslie Van Houten. That Monday, there were 2 phone calls reporting that Hughes was stranded. One was to the court clerk, which was anonymous, and the other was a call from a man saying that he was Hughes. to the answering service of Paul Fitzgerald. However, there were no telephones in the area that Hughes was supposed to be in. In another mysterious development, a newsman checked Hughes's garage that Tuesday and found a note signed by a Larry Dyer that read, "I told the court you were stuck at Sespe, and according to the CHP, California Highway Patrol, you're to be there 2 or 3 days at least. I also called Fitzgerald and let them know." According to one source, Dyer would deny saying that he had called Fitzgerald's office. He passed away in 1995. On December 4th, 1970, The Independent posted an article titled, "New Tate Face Recalls Tregoff Trial." It was about how Maxwell Keith had been appointed to be the lawyer or co-counsel for Leslie Van Houten. The article called him the Ivy League hillbilly. Seriously, because of his country boy mien and erudite mind. I didn't make that up. That was in the article. The article right below it, though, had talked about how the trial transcripts were found in Lauren Elder's car. She's quoted as having said, "I got the impression from him, Ronald Hughes, he wasn't too worried about not being able to get out. I don't think he thought he'd have any trouble leaving at a later time." Lauren said her car got stuck in the mud, and her and James Forsher were picked up by 2 other campers. A number of cabins were scattered throughout the area, and it was thought possible that Ronald Hughes might have taken shelter in one of the many cabins, which were stocked with food, water, and clothing. The San Bernardino County Sun also posted an article on December 4th talking about Maxwell Keith's appointment as Leslie Van Houten's co-counsel. When Judge Older appointed Keith, the defendants shouted demands that they be allowed to fire all defense attorneys and present their own defense. To quote Leslie, she said, "I wish to be heard. I don't accept this man as my counsel. Also, I wish to testify," she said, pointing at Maxwell Keith. "You're cutting our throats and not letting us defend ourselves," Patricia Krenwinkel said. And Susan Atkins is quoted as having said, "We have 21 witnesses and are willing to get up and testify in behalf of our own defense." Manson attempted to lecture Judge Older on the problems Keith would face as co-counsel, such as the 18,000 words of transcripts that he'd have to catch up on, and it's impossible for him to achieve that. Judge Older ordered everyone to sit down and denied all attempts to reopen the defense and to fire the attorneys. Maxwell Keith was a defense attorney in the sensational murder trial several years before of Dr. Bernard Finch, who was convicted of killing his wife. Keith told the court that he accepted the co-counsel for Leslie Van Houten. Older told Keith that he was having the clerk prepare the transcript of the trial, which was in its 24th week at that time. Keith said that he had been following the case sporadically in the news and that it may have taken him a week or 2 to catch up. When asked if he might reopen the defense, Keith said, "There may be reasons to reopen." The question was posed what he would do if Ronald Hughes appeared, and he replied, "Darn if I know." Paul Fitzgerald said that he and the other defense attorneys agreed not to reopen the defense, but he felt the judge would have to do it if Keith requested. On December 5th, 1970, Ventura County Star posted an article titled, "Mystery Deep in Search for Lawyer in Tate Trial." It was about how the search for Ronald Hughes had been suspended temporarily, while authorities reevaluated which facts are myth and which facts are truth. The day before, 23 Ventura and Los Angeles County Sheriff's deputies, along with members of the Fillmore and Upper Ojai rescue teams, scoured Sespe for Hughes, but were fruitless. "We didn't find any sign at all. But with that many guys out there, we should have seen something. But you can never tell. We looked for that Boy Scout for 4 days, and he was where we were looking all the time." A quote from Don McKendry of the Fillmore Search Group. Sergeant Bill Lindgren said Hughes was 250 pounds and not athletic. If he is stranded in the wilderness area, his chances of survival are considered slim. Fears of Hughes' safety grew. The cold nights combined with Hughes' lack of hiking abilities, lack of food, and proper clothing added to the dim outlook. If Hughes did slip and fall into a creek or bubbling hot spring pool, his body may have been washed downstream, miles, in the rain, swollen Sespe Creek. After the prior day's fruitless search, the search force sat down to create a new strategy. The decision was made again to question all persons who were known to have been in Sespe over the Thanksgiving weekend. James Forsher of Los Angeles, along with his girlfriend Lauren Elder, said that they drove Hughes in the area November 27th, and they were the first questioned. Forsher's story remained unchanged. Forsher told the deputies at the hot springs with Ronald Hughes, but when the rains came on Friday, November 27th, they decided to leave the next day. Hughes told them he would stay behind. The couple drove 2 miles, then had to abandon the car, which was Elder's. They were able to get a ride out before the roads were washed out. The ground search centered around the abandoned car and the hot spring. That Wednesday, Sergeant Lindgren and a Los Angeles deputy found the Tate LaBianca trial transcripts in Lauren Elder's car, indicating for the first time that Hughes might have been in the area. We worked our way back up about 2 miles to the hot spring, then we started back downstream. We covered both sides of the creek. We didn't find a thing. Quote from Sergeant Lindgren. One chopper flew the search party into the Sespe hot springs in the morning. Searchers fanned out over the rugged terrain, and they found an abandoned campsite, but no indication that Hughes had been there. In the afternoon, they trudged back over the area along with Sespe Creek. Deer and raccoon tracks were found. In addition to the Hughes search, 2 detectives were on the scene looking for an escaped convict from Soledad Prison, named Robert Lee Lively. Lively was reportedly with Charles W. Guerin, who was found dead in a hot spring pool Thanksgiving of 1970. On December 7, 1970, the Democrat and Chronicle posted an article saying, "Vanishing lawyer stalls the Tate trial." Ronald Hughes was described as a 35-year-old, bearded 250-pounder with long blonde hair falling from a bald pate. No one seemed to know what had happened to him after vanishing in Sespe Hot Springs. A massive search was done in the area, though it failed to locate him. The article stated that Leslie Van Houten had been appointed a new lawyer, though he had over 18,000 pages of trial transcripts to sift through. Interestingly, the article stated that Leslie could have potentially sought a mistrial on the grounds of being inadequately represented, because her new attorney entered the case so late. By the time of the article, the Tate LaBianca trial had entered its 25th week. Friends of Hughes said that he had headed for Sespe, which was a favorite retreat of his, to study the transcripts in solitude and prepare his closing argument. Friends who were there with him left the area while he stayed, and he was not seen since. Paul Fitzgerald said that confidential papers relating to the trial were found in the car at the retreat, and he was certain that Hughes wouldn't have left them behind voluntarily. The article states that it was not the first time Hughes caused consternation at the trial. He had been the most colorful member of the defense team. Making no secret of being a pauper, he had no office and operated out of his home, a 2-car garage where he slept on a mattress on the floor. He bought his suits at a movie studio auction for $5 each, and he proudly showed labels that said they'd once belonged to stars such as Spencer Tracy and Raymond Burr. A native New Yorker, Hughes was a graduate of Queens College, migrated to California, worked at odd jobs, then decided to take up law. He graduated from University of California at Los Angeles Law School and worked as a clerk in the public defender's office while studying for the bar exam. He passed on the 4th try. Some called Hughes the hippie lawyer of the case because of his appearance and friendships with hippie-type people. He knew Manson and his communal family months before members of the group were charged in the Tate murders. What's interesting to me is how this article mentions Hughes having known the family beforehand. Very rarely do you find any literature that says that, in my opinion. It has always been made to seem like Hughes was randomly selected. I don't know why it was always made to seem like he had no prior friendship with the family, but Helter Skelter made it seem that way. I wonder what the point of that was. It feels like Bugliosi tried to cover that up for some reason. Surely he knew more than what he wrote. This article was the first time I saw anything anywhere saying that Ron Hughes was from New York. I hadn't seen any other sources at that point in time that it said that. An article from the Los Angeles Times, dated December 8th, 1970, stated that Leslie's replacement lawyer, Maxwell Keith, would be ready to resume the trial tentatively by December 16th, 1970. The trial was a day-to-day adjournment for Keith to prepare. Judge Charles Older ordered the attorneys to check with the court each morning. It states that the two 17-year-olds left Hughes at Sespe on November 28, 1970, when their Volkswagen became mired in the mud. There were widespread ground and air searches, and they described Hughes as having Santa Claus whiskers and collar-length hair. The search was suspended that previous weekend while sheriff's detectives investigated the stories of persons evacuated from the storm-hit area. 30 deputies were planned to go back and scour Sespe. There was a report of a man that fit Hughes's description seen on the freeway near Newhall, but this turned out to be groundless, and apparently this man was an actor who was returning from location at Pinu. Hughes's mother, Anita Hughes, arrived in Los Angeles from New York and was driven to Ventura by the lawyer's uncle, Ray Davis. She had asked Ventura County Sheriff's Office if she could accompany them on that day's search, but they denied the request, saying the terrain was too rugged for a woman. Judge Older met with the attorneys that Monday in the chambers. When they emerged, they said that Older had tentatively rejected a defense mistrial motion for Leslie Van Houten, and Paul Fitzgerald said the defense opposed any further delay in the trial and suggested that Van Houten's case should be severed. I never personally understood why Leslie was lumped into the trial when she was part of the LaBianca murders only. From a legal standpoint, it would seem easier to convict her of something separately, as opposed to how the prosecution initially did it. I think this is just hubris for the prosecution, who tried to do everything all at once. Not to go off on a tangent, but it seems clear to me that at least some of the prosecution saw the crimes as in trial as a meal ticket and way to achieve fame, as opposed to prosecuting for the sake of justice and truth. On December 11th, 1970, the Belleville News-Democrat posted an article about Hughes's disappearance. Many articles shared this same article or idea, where the idea was that Hughes's disappearance was like something from a movie. At the time, billionaire Howard Hughes had went missing after departing for the West Indies for a vacation. Howard Hughes would later pass away on April 5th, 1976. On December 22nd, 1970, the Hawaii Tribune-Herald posted an article stating that 3 women in Tate case ousted for bad behavior. It was, of course, about Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Leslie Van Houten being ousted from court for bad behavior, something that has been well documented in much of Manson literature. The women were removed from court after a scuffle with bailiffs, where they had shouted at the judge and audience, and Leslie Van Houten protested appointment of a substitute for her lawyer, Ronald Hughes. She is quoted saying, "I have nothing to do with Mr. Ronald Hughes disappearing. In fact, I'm wondering what you did with him." This article went on to say that she tussled with deputies, slapping one bailiff on the hand, and told the judge, "I'd strike you if I could." She was ushered out with the others, who pointed at Manson and shouted, "You have an innocent man here." On December 22, 1970, the Daily News Leader posted an article titled, "Final Tate Arguments Underway." It was basically a recap of the other article, talking about the defendants being ousted from the courtroom. The Detroit Free Press posted an article on December 22, 1970, titled, "Mistrial Refused Over Lost Tate Lawyer." The mistrial motion that was stemming from Hughes's disappearance was denied. The defendants were again ejected from court as they shouted their objections over a new attorney, Maxwell Keith. Judge Older refuted the contention that Leslie Van Houten couldn't get a fair trial because her attorney vanished. Older is quoted as having said, "I don't see any reason why a defendant, under these circumstances, shouldn't be adequately represented by substitute counsel." The article states that Leslie wanted to hire a female lawyer, Mary Fielder, who was not in the court. Judge Older said that he couldn't tolerate any further continuances in the 6-month-old trial, noting that a new attorney would require considerable time to prepare for the case, and he pointed out that Van Houten already had 5 attorneys. The appointee, of course, was Maxwell Keith, who the defendants disapproved of. Leslie is quoted as before from the article previously, saying that she had no idea what happened to Ronald Hughes. When she asked the judge what she did with him, Manson shouted, "Hear, hear," and Susan Atkins yelled, "Right on." Van Houten continued shouting that Keith was inadequate and incapable, and the judge ordered for bailiffs to seat her. Leslie then broke away from their grasp and slapped one of them, and the other defendants arose and began shouting at the judge. Older ordered them removed to nearby rooms to listen to the trial, where the prosecution proceeded with its closing arguments. There was an interesting snippet posted by Ventura County Star dated December 31st, 1970. It was about how a man named Jim Couleris looked like Ronald Hughes and was in a strange spot for being mistaken for him. Now we'll skip forward to March of 1971. Before Ronald Hughes was found, another body was found in Sespe early in March. On March 12, 1971, Ventura County Star posted an article titled, "Coroner Orders Autopsy for Youth Found in Sespe." The teen had died the day prior, March 11th. The youth was believed to be 19 years old and from the Long Beach area, and had been living in a trailer 1/4 mile from the hot springs for the previous month. The youth didn't have any identification on him. The coroner's office had a tentative identification from other young people that were living in the area. Sergeant Bill Lindgren, who was in Sespe for another assignment, Ronald Hughes, was led to the body by other young people. They told Lindgren the deceased had complained of severe headaches Wednesday night and then suffered a seizure the day before. They apparently attempted to revive him, but failed. On March 13, 1971, Ventura County Star posted an update titled, "Youth Found Dead, Identified, Virus Blamed." The deceased was identified as Ricky Wayne Childs, 19. He came from Long Beach the month prior to live in the Sespe region. Coroner's deputy said the cause of death was what appeared to be a meningitis pneumonia virus that he had contracted Wednesday, following a self-imposed 2-week fast. Ricky Wayne Childs, whose family lived in Texas, had joined the commune in the forest in February of 1971 in a back-to-nature move that eventually denied proper medical care. The coroner reported that Ricky's friends tried to find medication, even aspirin, but they could only locate one Seconal tablet. A raging fever led to convulsions and then death at daybreak. The coroner's deputies were able to locate his mother, Mary Earl of Fort Worth, Texas. He was to be buried in San Antonio. Ricky's mother told Deputy Peters that the family had lived in Long Beach until 2 years before, and that her son had stayed when the rest moved to Texas. She hadn't seen her son for the past year. The commune Ricky lived in was about 25 miles from Highway 33 and only 3/4 of a mile from the hot springs. Records on Family Search show that Ricky Childs was born on June 30th, 1951 in Bexar County, Texas. He passed away on March 11th, 1971. His parents were Bade and Ray Childs and Mary Gwendolyn Center. Ricky was buried at Sunset Memorial Park in San Antonio, Texas. Currently, there are no other profiles connected with his page. Ricky's father, Baden Ray Childs, passed away on September 21st, 1985, in San Francisco, California. He was 55 years old. Mary Earl was born on September 11th, 1930. She passed away on December 11th, 1992, at 62 years old. She is also buried at Sunset Memorial Park, though there isn't a Find a Grave page for her, but there is a Billion Graves page. In a strange and potentially completely unrelated event, there was an article posted by the Press Democrat on March 19th of 1971. It was titled, "3 Hippies Seek Chaos via Phones." It was about 3 hippies that mailed phony bills to 20,000 San Francisco residents whose goal was to create worldwide chaos by tying up everyone's phone. Recipients of the bills flooded a bank, newspaper, 2 TV stations, and police with phone calls. The bills were $76.40 each. The hippies called themselves Sam's Cafe and was run by Mark Kyer and his wife Terry and their friend David Shire. The 3 once ran an avant-garde art gallery in Berkeley called Sam's Cafe, which went broke in 1970. This probably has nothing to do with the Manson family, but I just kind of thought it was pretty interesting. A March 29th article claims that fishermen reported a large, badly decomposed body. On March 30th, 1971, the Camarillo Star posted the article, "Sespe Body Removed by Copter." It was stated that a badly decomposed body was evacuated by helicopter about 7 miles from where Hughes was last seen. John Chessman and John Wells located the body face down in a pool of water in an area called the Narrows. Officer Mike Freeman said it was possible the flood water carried the body downstream. The article said that the normally small stream turned into a raging torrent, and it was presumed that Hughes got caught in the flood and drowned. The Camarillo Star posted on the front page, "Manson girls sentenced to gas chamber" on March 30th, 1971. The Ojai History blog has a post from March 31st, 1971. Originally posted in the Ojai Valley News with the title, "Body Found in Sespe Area, Probably Manson Attorney." It said that the Ventura County Sheriff's deputies traveled to Los Angeles to pick up dental records that could conclusively tell if the body was Ronald Hughes. Although the body was the right size, tests had been inconclusive at that point. A friend of Hughes was of the firm opinion that it was him. The article says that Hughes was 235 pounds. The body was found Saturday by 2 fishermen. The body found laying in ice-cold water that was 7 miles southeast of the hot springs. The spot was in the middle of Condor Refuge and near Pigeon Flat. Despite search, rescue, and even mystic teams that went looking for Ronald Hughes, none were able to find him. Apparently, none had entered the region that his body was at. To quote, one person said, "It was not searched before because the area is so rugged and the creek was up so far. It was inaccessible. The area is known as the Narrows. The creek runs from mountain to mountain." Despite the fishermen finding the body Saturday, it was not reported to the sheriff's department until Sunday night. The body was lifted out by helicopter that Monday and taken to Skillen Mortuary in Santa Paula. The body was naked except for remnants of a shirt around the neck. Although the head was battered beyond recognition, apparently from being washed downstream, officials said the remains were quite well preserved by the icy water. Autopsy work began Tuesday and was expected to take another couple of days. There were no outward signs of foul play. Along with dental records, fingerprints were used to aid in identification. Samples of Ronald's fingerprints were provided by Paul Fitzgerald. Fitzgerald had gone to Ventura County to view the body. He said he was positive it was Hughes. He had a strange-shaped head, sort of a majestic configuration. The head is the same. Some of the beard is still there. Fitzgerald is quoted. The discovery came on the same day that the defendants of the Manson trial were given the death penalty. On March 31st, 1971, Redlands Daily Facts posted an article titled, "Body Believed That of Ronald Hughes." It was about an autopsy having been performed on the body believed to be Hughes. Ventura County said the autopsy failed to immediately determine the cause of death. Another article from that same day states that Paul Fitzgerald called Hughes's parents over the discovery. His parents said that they were relieved that their ordeal of waiting for a definite word had ended. A tennis shoe was found by Hughes's body. And this article states that Hughes had visited the Manson family headquarters at Spawn Ranch in June of 1970. The Salt Lake Tribune also has an article from the same day, March 31st, saying that Hughes's body was well preserved because of the cold water at Sespe. Deputy Coroner Merle Peters said the body was nude except for the fringed shirt, and contrary to reports of fishermen who found the body, the arm was not missing. The fishermen may have been misled by the bodies lying slightly on one side. Meanwhile, the defendants to the Manson trial were given the death penalty. The Press-Democrat also states that Hughes's body was found in an advanced state of decomposition. Now for April 1971. On April 1st, 1971, the Sacramento Bee posted an article stating that the body had been Hughes. The comparison was made through dental charts. The deputy coroner said no cause of death had been established, and it was unknown how long Hughes had been dead for. The Independent said in an article, also dated April 1st, that the coroner believed finding out the cause for Hughes's death may never be known. It's doubtful that the exact cause will be pinpointed because the body's advanced stage of decay. The autopsy showed no signs of violent death or skull fractures, knife wounds, or bullet holes. He didn't have a heart either. We can't positively say that it was drowning either, just because he was found in a creek. Valley News stated in an article dated April 1st that Hughes's parents would be informed that their son would be buried in Los Angeles. His parents lived in Englewood Cliffs, New Jersey at the time. On April 4th, 1971, the Valley News posted Ronald Hughes, lawyer, to be buried on Wednesday. Funeral services were to be held in Westwood. Services were at Gates Kingley and Gates Mortuary at Sepulveda Boulevard. Burial was to be at Westwood Memorial Park. Hughes's parents expressed the desire to have their son buried in Los Angeles, where he has friends. On April 8, 1971, the Los Angeles Times posted that services had been held for Ronald Hughes. Paul Fitzgerald eulogized him for what he wasn't, not for what he was. He wasn't materialistic. He wasn't vain. He wasn't punctual. 36 people attended the funeral, such as his parents, sister, Day Shin, Irving Kanarek, and of course, Paul Fitzgerald. Ronald Hughes was buried at Westwood Memorial Park. This wasn't the first time that someone went missing or died at Sespe. Of course, there's the case of Ricky Wayne Childs, who died just a few weeks before Ronald Hughes's body was found. There was also a lost Boy Scout a year prior. In March of 1970, a Boy Scout named Bill Sternberg, who was 11, became lost in the Santa Paula mountain country for 4 days. He had wandered away from Big Cone Campground, which incited a massive search for him. He was found less than a mile from the campground. Thankfully, he was found alive and had a small stay at the hospital. This scenario was mentioned in a December article about Ronald Hughes. This was also the case of the 2 escaped convicts, one of which died just a couple of days before Ronald Hughes went officially missing. Charles W. Guerin was found in a shallow grave or floating in a hot spring pool in the Sespe area, depending on what source you read. I'm unsure of how he died exactly, but I couldn't find a reason. An article from the Fort Worth Star-Telegram states that coroners found marks on Guerin's body, suggesting foul play. The Independent posted on March 21, 1971, that Guerin had escaped with a Robert Lee Lively, who later ran to Galveston, Texas. Lively was later extradited back to California. Later, in September of 1971, Ventura County Star posted an article about a commune, or communal-type living. It was described as the order of the day at Sespe. A woman was shown talking to friends who were nude in a sauna bath. The article mentioned how most of the people at the hot springs were in their teens and early 20s, and all nearly nude. Of course, drugs were a part of the culture, joints being pictured. To quote, "For a while, a dozen or so youths lived in an abandoned mining company trailer on Poplar Creek behind the hot springs. By the sheriff's department's request, after a youth living there died of pneumonia." In 1976, the California courts overturned Leslie Van Houten's murder conviction, ruling that Maxwell Keith hadn't had enough time to prepare after replacing Ronald Hughes. Various sources state that Hughes's disappearance should have resulted in a mistrial. This led to Leslie having new trials. Eventually, she would be convicted and sent to the California Institute for Women, where she would eventually be paroled in July of 2023. In conclusion, I suppose you could say, it's clear to me that the defense for Manson and the girls was never about defending the accused. After researching everything for this video, it's clear to me that the defense's tactic was to do whatever they could to get a mistrial. The entire scenario is a circus, and I didn't even go that deeply into the trial itself, surprisingly. Do I think that the Manson family killed Ronald Hughes? Not directly. Not straight up, they beat him up. I don't think that. In an indirect way, yes. I think it's clear that Hughes was just sort of an unlucky guy. It seems very likely that he really did get caught up in the elements and drowned due to flash flooding. Of course, that's how it seems on the outside, since his autopsy doesn't seem to be available, and we don't know what was the true status of his body when it was found. Many sources say that Manson told Hughes he didn't want to see him in the courtroom ever again, right before he went missing. It's hard to read that and not think that the Manson family had something to do with Hughes's death. Bugliosi seemed to believe that they did. This was only compounded by the fact that various members of the family admitted to it. Through all of this, I had some questions. I still have questions about this. The first being, why was Ronald Hughes hanging out with a couple of 17-year-olds? Why did Ronald stay behind when the court transcripts were still in the car? Was Ronald Hughes affiliated with the commune that lived near Sespe Hot Springs? And finally, why did the news report that Hughes's body was well preserved, then go on to say it was badly decomposed? What happened here? What was up with that? If Ronald Hughes wasn't murdered by the Manson family, I guess I could believe that if his body was perfectly preserved in the ice water and it showed no changes. But on the flip side, if his body was actually badly decomposed when found, there's no way we could ever prove whether he was or wasn't murdered. Unfortunately, even through all my own research, I still think that this is inconclusive, and a strange story, if anything.